Jake tightened his coat against the biting cold as he stepped out of his office building. The city was alive with twinkling lights and the distant sound of holiday music, but his mind was elsewhere. It had been a long day, and all he wanted was to get home, maybe grab a drink at the office party before calling it a night. But as he turned the corner, he stopped. A woman sat on the sidewalk, wrapped in an old, oversized coat. Her dark hair was tangled, her hands gripping a worn-out bag. Something about her felt different. Unlike the others he had seen on the streets, she wasn't begging. She wasn't even looking up. Instead, she stared at the ground, lost in thought. Jake hesitated. People passed by, barely sparing her a glance. He could have walked away too, but something in his gut told him not to. He crouched down, offering a small smile. "Hey, it's freezing out here. My office is having a party upstairs. There's food, warmth. You don't have to be out here alone." The woman looked up, her tired eyes studying him carefully. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, almost as if she had nothing left to lose, she gave a small nod. "All right." Leading her inside, Jake felt a mix of emotions. He didn't know what people would say, but he didn't care. As they entered the brightly lit office, laughter and music filled the air. But then something changed. Conversations stopped. People turned, eyes widening in shock. The murmurs started almost instantly. And then, from across the room, the CEO himself froze in place. His face went pale as he whispered, "Sarah?" The room fell silent. The CEO, Mr. Carter, stood frozen, his eyes locked onto the woman standing beside Jake. His usually confident posture wavered as he took a hesitant step forward. The murmurs grew louder. People exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Who was she? And why did their boss look like he had just seen a ghost? Jake glanced between the woman and Mr. Carter, confusion tightening in his chest. "Sarah," he repeated under his breath. The woman beside him tensed. Her fingers gripped the strap of her bag a little tighter, her gaze dropping to the floor. Mr. Carter swallowed hard before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where have you been?" Sarah finally looked up, and for the first time, Jake saw something in her eyes. Pain, exhaustion, and something else. Betrayal. "Does it matter?" she said quietly. Her voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable weight behind her words. The employees stood frozen, unsure whether to keep watching or quietly slip away. The holiday music played on in the background, a sharp contrast to the tension thickening in the air. Jake felt like he had walked straight into something much bigger than he could understand. He turned to Sarah, his mind racing. How had he not recognized her? He had seen pictures of the CEO's wife before, at company events, in framed photos in Mr. Carter's office. But the woman in those pictures was different. Smiling, elegant, dressed in designer clothes. Not like this. Not like someone who had spent months, maybe years, on the streets. Jake finally spoke, his voice careful. "You two know each other." Sarah exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "Yeah," she said. "We used to be married." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Asterisk we used to be married asterisk the room, once filled with laughter and holiday cheer, now felt suffocatingly silent. Jake's mind raced. This woman, this homeless woman he had invited in out of kindness, wasn't just anyone. She was the CEO's wife, or at least she had been. Mr. Carter's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Sarah, why are you here?" His voice was a mix of shock and something else, something darker. Sarah let out a bitter chuckle. "You make it sound like I showed up on purpose." Her eyes flickered around the room, taking in the curious stares, the hushed whispers. "I didn't come here to make a scene." Jake shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure what he had walked into, but he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. "Look, I didn't know." He started, but Sarah cut him off with a shake of her head. "I know," she said. "You were just being kind." She turned back to Mr. Carter, her expression unreadable. "Something you used to be." A flash of something, regret, guilt, crossed Mr. Carter's face before he masked it with a hardened look. "You disappeared," he said, his voice lower now, meant only for her. "No explanation. No word. Nothing." Sarah's eyes darkened. "And you didn't come looking for me." The tension between them was almost unbearable. The employees stood awkwardly, unsure if they were witnessing a deeply personal moment or something they should step away from. But no one moved. Jake finally spoke, his voice careful. "What happened?" Sarah looked at him, then back at Mr. Carter. "Why don't you tell him?" she said. "Tell him why your wife ended up on the streets." Mr. Carter's face went pale, his carefully controlled expression slipping for the first time. The entire office felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for him to respond. Jake looked between them, his pulse quickening. He had no idea what had happened between them, but whatever it wasn't simple. Mr. Carter started, but his voice faltered. He glanced around, aware of the eyes watching him. His employees, his carefully built reputation, everything was at stake. "This isn't the time or place." Sarah let out a cold laugh. "Convenient," she muttered, shaking her head. "It never is it?" Jake felt the tension in the room tighten like a noose. He had only wanted to help someone, to do a good deed, but now he was in the middle of something far bigger than he had bargained for. Sarah crossed her arms, her gaze locked on Mr. Carter. "You want to pretend like I just disappeared. Fine, but you know the truth. You know why I left." Jake could see it now, something deeper than just a broken marriage. There was a secret here, something buried beneath years of silence. "I didn't know where you were," Mr. Carter finally said, but there was doubt in his own voice. Sarah took a step closer, her voice quiet but sharp. "You didn't want to know." The employees exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether they should stay or find a way to quietly leave. But no one moved. No one wanted to miss what was coming next. Jake exhaled, his chest tightening. "What happened?" he asked again, barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes never left Mr. Carter's. "Tell him," she said, "or I will." Mr. Carter's lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. The weight of Sarah's stare pinned him in place, and for the first time, he looked unsure, almost afraid. The employees watched in frozen silence, the holiday lights casting strange shadows on their faces. Jake felt his own pulse in his ears. He had walked into this night expecting nothing more than a simple office party. Now he was caught in the middle of something that felt too big, too personal. He wasn't sure if he even wanted to hear the truth anymore. But he couldn't look away. Sarah's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. "You always knew where I was," she said, her voice shaking now. "You knew what happened to me, and you let it." Mr. Carter flinched, his mask of power and control slipping further. "That's not true," he said quickly, but there was no conviction behind it. Sarah took a shaky breath. "I had nothing. After I left, I lost everything. But you knew that, didn't you? You made sure of it." A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jake felt his stomach twist. "What is she talking about?" he asked, his voice tense. Sarah turned to him, eyes filled with something raw and unfiltered. "I didn't just leave," she said. "I was forced out. Everything I had, my accounts, my home, was taken. And guess who made sure I had nowhere to go?" Jake's breath caught in his throat. He looked back at Mr. Carter, who now looked as if he wanted to be anywhere but here. "I never wanted that," Mr. Carter finally said, but it was too late. Sarah shook her head. "Then tell me, why was my name erased from everything?" Mr. Carter's face drained of color. The room, still filled with murmuring employees, felt unbearably small. Jake stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had just heard. Erased? How was that even possible? Sarah's voice wavered, but she refused to break. "You didn't just move on, Carter. You wiped me out. My name, my existence, gone. I lost everything overnight, and you let me think I had no way back." Mr. Carter exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand." "Then make me," Sarah shot back. The CEO's hands clenched at his sides before he finally spoke. "There were legal issues. I was told you wanted nothing to do with me, that you signed off on everything." His voice was tight, defensive, but beneath it there was something else, doubt. Sarah shook her head. "I never signed anything." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jake's stomach twisted as realization dawned. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. Someone had orchestrated this. Mr. Carter looked genuinely shaken now. I don't understand. The paperwork, the lawyers, they told me you." He trailed off, his eyes widening as the truth began to settle in. Sarah let out a hollow laugh. "You trusted the wrong people." Silence fell over the room. Mr. Carter's world, the one he had built so carefully, was beginning to crack. The betrayal wasn't just between them. Someone else had been pulling the strings. Jake took a step forward, his voice steady. "Then the question is, who wanted her gone?" Mr. Carter turned, scanning the room, realization dawning in his eyes. Sarah crossed her arms. "I think we both know who," she said. And then, from the back of the crowd, a voice spoke. "Well, this is unfortunate." Every head in the room turned toward the voice. Stepping out from the shadows was Mr. Carter's longtime business partner, Richard Hale. His expression was calm, almost amused, as if he had been waiting for this moment. Sarah's fists clenched. "Of course," she muttered. Mr. Carter's face hardened. "Richard, what did you do?" Richard sighed. Adjusting his tie like this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "I did what was necessary," he said smoothly. Sarah was a distraction, an obstacle in the company's future. "You were too blinded by love to make the hard choices, so I did it for you." Jake felt a chill run through him. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was sabotage. Sarah shook her head in disbelief. "You destroyed my life to protect a company." Richard smirked. "And look where it got us. Carter, you became more powerful than ever. No messy divorce, no scandal. Just a clean slate." Mr. Carter's expression shifted, something breaking inside him. He turned to Sarah, his voice unsteady. "I never wanted this." "But you let it happen," she whispered. Security arrived before Richard could slip away. Mr. Carter barely had to say a word before they let him out, his protests drowned by the murmurs of the stunned employees. Jake exhaled, finally breaking his silence. "So, what happens now?" Sarah looked at Mr. Carter, then down at the floor. The anger in her eyes had softened, but the damage was already done. "I don't know," she admitted, "but at least I finally have the truth." Mr. Carter swallowed hard. "Let me fix this." Sarah gave him a long look before turning away. "We'll see." And with that, she walked out the door, stepping into a future she would now decide for herself.